welcome back. Hope you had a wonderful restorative lunch break. I would just like to put in a reminder, there are 3 opportunities for you to practice generosity here at the retreat today. One is there are these most beautiful mini tankas over here on the table. It's either right next to the standing Buddha figurine there. And you're welcome to take one of those that you would like for an optional $15 donation to Urban Dharma. If it has to be 10, that's fine. If it can be more, that's great. So it's a donation. And then there's a donation to Ecumenical Buddhist Society in the center room, in the shoe room, in the bathroom room. And then in the front, there's a basket for Dana for the teacher. I know many of you have already seen that, so I just wanted to say that reminder and welcome you back.
So we're back for the final session. Well, we might break it up into 2 for this weekend retreat. So we were at the beginning of looking at the 3 types of compassion. And of course, the types of compassion, as we were saying, has less to do with 3 different groups, 3 different objects of compassion, but rather 3, you could say, 3 ways in which your compassion is more and more informed by insight, wisdom. So you could say before the first type that we've already talked about, perhaps the closest we get to karuna is what we would call literally to suffer with, compassion. So that's where maybe most of us can do without practice, to suffer with. And that's actually very good, because there are one step behind that, or a few steps behind that, are those who have a hard time suffering with, not even capable of, prefer not to do, don't care enough, right? So that's even further back in terms of waking up to this innate karuna. So we have to look at it as a spectrum. Like maybe even to suffer with, we're not very good at doing that. We are even more self-absorbed, more self-grasping, so much more that we don't even have the capacity to suffer with. So we just go about not understanding, like why is this person so miserable? God. Yeah. So we don't even have that, So then to have compassion, in the literal sense of the English word, to suffer with, can mean, some softening up has happened. But we don't want to remain there. And in fact, remaining there can lead to being completely rendered powerless, and then falling into depression, and into completely not able to either protect yourself nor benefit anyone. Then the first step, or the next step, would be, if you don't let compassion pull you down that way, then you make that transition into the first type of compassion that we discussed. So that is where you kind of see. And so it's easy to have compassion for those who are victims. It's a lot harder to have compassion for those whom, conventionally could legitimately be, labeled as victimizer. It's a lot harder. It's easy to have compassion for poor people. It's really hard to have compassion for rich people, or at least people who are richer than you. It's like, what? Compassion? Who's showing me compassion? They're doing pretty well. But it is said that Buddhists have compassion for even 10th level bodhisattva. What's a 10th level bodhisattva? You're like 10th level, 9th level, 7.5. Well, just to give you an idea, right? They say, I don't know, I'm not met. At least I don't think I've met. They say first level bodhisattva has the capacity to be simultaneously present in 100 places. It's like a superhero for superheroes. Yeah. So 10th level bodhisattva. You're like, man, they're pretty swell. But Buddhists have compassion for 10th level bodhisattvas. Buddhists can see clearly how they still have suffering. That's really, 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 really tough. Yeah, so here, this first type of compassion, whether they are rich, whether they are people in power, whether they are people, all of the things that are better than you, we can have karuna for them. We can sincerely wish them to be free from suffering. When we begin to see that, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how rich they are, no matter how successful they are, no matter how good looking they are, no matter whatever they are still under the power of this basic problem, which is, firstly, with the thought of I, they cling to self. And then with the thought of mind, they grow attached to things. And as a result, we become helpless. And then we are we become powerless, like a turning water wheel. To these beings, the compassion that is directed to these beings, the compassion that arises for these beings, Chandakirti says, I pay homage to that. Paying homage means I really respect that. I really admire that. I really value that. So in other words, no, it's not like paying respect in hopes that, compassion will ding, 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 and make magic in your life. But rather that I really respect that. I really honor that. I really want to achieve that. This is the first kind of compassion. Then it is said that the second kind of compassion is indicated in beings are like the moon in rippling water, fitful, fleeting, empty in their nature. In the first kind of compassion, we can see how or we can see clearer now, actually, it's due to a number of factors coming together, and primarily the factor of a sense of I, which then necessitates a sense of other, which then pitches self against other, or self possessing other, and so on and so forth, attachment and aversion, confusion giving rise to attachment and aversion, and therefore this whole mess is here, and so that's. The second, a deeper kind of compassion of karuna arises from seeing how, in fact, the status of beings are just like reflection of the moon on rippling water. The reflection of the moon on rippling water. And so they are fitful, fleeting, and empty in their nature. So here is talking about the illusory like nature of things. So it's a more subtle understanding of when we say, you know, Bill is suffering, or Betsy is suffering. What are we really talking about? So the first level would be to say, well, because of this grasping that Betsy has, then to the degree that Betsy thinks, whenever Betsy thinks of self in a very strong way, then strong suffering comes. Then in response to observing the strong suffering that's happening, I have compassion for. But then now, I look deeper and I see, oh, actually, the Betsy that I had compassion for earlier, in fact, there isn't really a Betsy there. There is a Betsy to the degree that the water reflects the moon. So that is to, now the example given there is not to say that, and then there is a moon somewhere, go look for the moon. It's more saying that this reflection of the moon is an illusory entity. But although it's illusory, it's still visible. It's still visible. Then they say the third type of suffering, the third type of compassion is compassion for, this is in Chandrakirti's own commentary, he says that these two lines should be read twice, he says. At the first reading, the emphasis is on rippling water, fitful, fleeting. So kind of the rippling, the movement, so meaning unstable. So to see that, this Betsy that we're talking about actually has very unstable, well, not in an ordinary sense that she's unstable, but, like this perception that we have is unstable. It changes. It's not the same Betsy that turns up every moment in our relationship with her. And to be able to see that fitful, fleeting, that rippling water. The third most profound compassion, the emphasis or the italics needs to go at the empty in their nature part. So even more subtle level, even the rippling and the fitful and the fleeting is empty. Empty as in dependently arising. So actually it's not too different from the first one, but also very different. It's not too different as in the principle is the same. It's the level of how far are you zooming in, right? So when we superficially just kind of can think and operate as, you know, me, Han, having this body, and when I look at this gong, right? That's the superficial level of relating to this gong, or this wall, right? So as long as I'm still a human being, or 5 foot whatever, and this weight and this and all of that, I'm going to relate to this bell and that wall if I knock my head against it, right? But if you look deeper at this gong or this wall, the solidity that I experience on my coarse level, it's pretty solid. But if now I have more powerful lens and I look at this, I see that there are holes. There's space in between. But because proportionately I'm big, so I'm not able to poke my finger through it. But then if you have even more powerful microscope on the quantum level, then even those atoms that you are able to use another lens to see through, even those atoms don't exist. Empty. Don't exist doesn't mean a situation of nothing whatsoever, void. It means that on the one hand, it appears, but it appears to different people at different levels and different power of sight. It appears in relation to how powerful your sight is. So right now, sight is, oh, that thing is kind of fuzzy. Right? And then now, oh yeah, that thing is, better defined now. And even more powerful, even more defined, more defined. And then at a certain point, ironically, it'll be like, oh, there are gaps. Oh, there's more gaps, and more gaps, and more gaps, and more gaps. And in Buddhist magic, if you can imagine, they say, if you can transform your mind to be even smaller than the gap in between the atoms, then you can do the trick of putting your hand in and pulling it out, and putting it in and pulling it out. True or not, I don't know. It's said that when people came to challenge Milarepa to debates, he kind of played with them. And he asked these debaters who are very fixed in the categories of solidity is called solidity because it has the capacity to obstruct passage and to uphold things. So these are these Buddhist scholars that are trained in classical debate traditions. So they want to come and debate Milarepa. Milarepa is just this meditator hanging out in the caves. So then he reluctantly agreed for them to ask him questions. He said, I really don't want to debate, it's a waste of time. I say, but wouldn't you want to clarify the Dharma? He's like, okay, go ahead, start. So they start with and then they say, no, since, we'll let you start. Why don't you ask us questions? And I say, okay, I'll ask some simple ones. It's like, this wall in a cave. He says, is it solid or not? And they're like, well, yes, of course it's solid. And he said, why? He said, well, because of this. So, you know, they know their books, they know their text and everything. Milarepa says, so you're sure it's solid? It's like, yeah, it's solid. And of course, you know, Jedi mind tricks. He, like, walks through the wall and then walks back into the cave and he goes, it's not obstructing me. And the scholar monks are like, ugh. And Milarepa sat down, you know, probably very satisfied with himself. And then he said, so, what do you call this? They're like, space. And he said, so, what's the nature of space? What's the characteristic of space? They said, well, no obstruction, no shape, no solidity. He said, are you sure? I'm like, yeah. You know. So Buddha says so, you know, like we memorize the page and the verse and the number, you know, verse number and chapter and page. He said, okay. Then Milarepa apparently just kind of like got up and then he started to climb like a ladder. You know, step into space, step into space, step into space. He's standing up there. Hello? And then he came back down. Then they left, you know. So when we look deeper and deeper and deeper, these are like the levels of compassion. But let me read to you again, indebted to the book that I mentioned by John McCransky. And you know, it's useful, just a summary of these three types of compassion. So he says, kind of translating this into language that I think easier for us to understand, is the compassion that views the obvious suffering of beings. That's the first level. The compassion that views the obvious suffering of beings. And so obvious in this sense is obvious not to everybody, but obvious to, if you have a Buddhist understanding of what's going on, a basic Buddhist understanding, then obviously you understand suffering comes from the bifurcation into self and other. So that's the first. Then the compassion that senses beings in their impermanence. That's the second time. Back to Betsy. It's not the same Betsy. Even though going through the suffering, you know, several days or whatever, no, it's not the same Betsy. And in a way, the more we can see the impermanent nature, the inconstant nature, then we, in some ways, right, we don't reinforce the suffering. When each time we walk into the room, oh, poor you. Maybe not so dramatic, but in our minds, you know, this person is solidly suffering. Because we operate in a world where we seem to only have two choices. Either the person is suffering or not suffering. And it's because we have such a solid view of personhood. But if we're able to see that, yes, generally, yes, this person is in a state of suffering, but then there are all these openings. And so rather than be there, right, and further solidify that this person is suffering, it's just have the kind of compassion that senses their impermanence. And understanding that this person is suffering because, with regards to changing unstable conditions, this person has given rise to a sense of self and is grasping after that self. And so then we have compassion for there being disabuse of this false sense of self, of permanence. The third, according to the way he phrases it, is the compassion that knows the nature of mind. It's the kind of compassion that gets it, that understands that nothing happens. And yet, the appearance of suffering arises. And so you have compassion for that which is not really real. That's like the part about, having compassion that is so strong, so powerful, that it can even be for 10th stage bodhisattva. And here it's a little bit different, as in spite of recognizing that the nature of our minds, our innate nature is Buddha, and therefore all the problems, all the suffering, all the dissatisfaction that we think we have is all temporary, no core to them, no reality to them, is a mistake, and all of that. But yet, you are capable of having compassion, karuna. You're still able to say, may you be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And so I think what we're saying here is that, whether it's 3 or you want to make it 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, it's a more and more subtle view, or a stronger and stronger commitment to wanting everyone to be free from suffering, even as your insight into the nature of what's there increases. So you can sort of imagine a nuclear physicist having all the information as to how I am light and not particle here. So the view has arrived at I'm light, because of a certain way this is being measured. I'm light now and not particle. Or conversely, I'm particle and not light, or But that's view, right? But that view itself might lead to a very dry, pointless realization. Back to that jerk. Back to the one that says, well, get over it. There's no you. Stop suffering. Stop suffering. So he says here, at this third level, when the practitioner rests in that unconditioned nature of mind beyond the turmoil of self-grasping, a spontaneous will and energy of compassion radiates to all who have not yet found such safety. So for those who have not yet understood the nature of the mind, have compassion for them as well. Then the previous one is for those who cannot yet see that they are not one thing, that it's inconstant. Have compassion for them. The first group, for those who are clinging stubbornly to this gross sense of self and I, have compassion for them. So these are the 3 kinds of suffering. I mean, the 2 kinds of compassion in relation to the 3 kinds of suffering. So the first, the most kind of basic, gross explanation for why someone suffered because they have the sense of I, the belief in the I, and then suffering turn up. The second is because somebody or persons who don't see inconstancy, that don't see rippling, fitful, fleeting nature, then they suffer. So then we have compassion for that. The third kind is because this person don't see and get it, that they are not these thoughts, these conditions, these situations, but they are the innate Buddha mind. But for those who don't see that, we have suffering, we have compassion, we have karuna towards them. You see, suffering and compassion, very tricky. They become interchangeable. The sufferer is to be compassionate. So, we get into all these kind of like very dramatic displays of compassion. Another way of saying these three types of compassion in another commentary on the entry to the middle way, it says the compassion that has as its object beings generally in an unspecific sense. Then the compassion that has as its object beings in their impermanence. So the first one is just in general. Secondly is beings in their impermanence, and they are not recognizing impermanence and then making all kinds of assumptions, making all kinds of judgment, making all kinds of hopes based on not understanding constancy. We have compassion for them. And then compassion that has at its object beings in their lack of true essence. So in this commentary it says, you should understand that these three kinds of compassion have the same aspect, namely the attitude of wishing that beings be free from suffering. That's the definition of karuna. But they differ only in their specific objects. Meaning beings that are just suffering generally due to their sense of self having arisen, all of that, then beings who don't see inconstancy. So maybe, prior to even the first group, you're ordinary beings, not capable yet of even recognizing compassion and accepting compassion. Then you have the first step, beings who are general in a state of suffering. Then the next step is those who cannot see inconstancy or impermanence, therefore they suffer. And then the third type is those who kind of bound beings that are bound by kind of like their limited sense. Of concretizing or solidifying that which is spacious, that which is boundless. These three types of compassion, again, when you look at the list, it just sounds like, oh, we are splitting hair here. So let's look at, like, well then, okay, what does this mean? On the streets, so to say. What does this mean? What does this mean? On the streets. What does it mean? Let's say we get the first one, right? What about, why does it matter? The second and the third? Like practically think of it in terms of our taking into our experience. What does it mean? Why does it matter? How could it matter? Maybe let's put it that way. How could it matter? Yeah.
Because it might help you be discerning in how you respond.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Say more.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're going to try to help that person, and then maybe if you know the nature, like more specifically, why they're suffering, and you can say something helpful. Right?
Okay, but it's not knowing more as in the circumstances, the narrative behind the suffering, right?
No, but knowing which category out of these three. I don't know.
Yeah, it's there. I think.
Is that you recognize that there is suffering there?
You recognize that there's suffering there, yes.
Because if you don't, like, if you're not looking like that's suffering like related to things changing and being surprised that they're changing, then
right.
So why are you so upset?
Yes.
What's the big deal?
Right.
But so if you were just ignoring that altogether, then
right.
you'd be like, well, I'm not going to help you. There's no problem.
Yes.
And just get frustrated.
Yeah. When you see someone, right? Exactly. Yeah? Not getting the point of inconstancy, and they're in turmoil. And sometimes it's hard to have compassion for that, because you like, come on, don't you get it? Well, obviously not. But we can't help, like, don't you get it? And so to try to kind of stretch your capacity to have compassion.
Can you give an example of what that would look like? Someone not getting it?
Oh, Billy? You can give me some examples.
I just didn't get it right there.
I think most of the time. Yesterday we talked about in the context of vehicles. Yeah, Maha was in the car, and Nag and Bill, were talking about how often we just. And so yesterday at the end of the day, when we were all starting to leave, Maha couldn't find her key. So luckily we had a possible solution, which is, like we were all driving back to Conway. So I said, well, just get in our car and we'll drop Maha off, and then there's a spare key at home, then we'll pick her up and bring her back here. But nonetheless, something unexpected. That's the inconstancy that just arose. And then I think Bill said, every time we park our car, we really are walking away thinking it has to start, or it has to be there when I'm back. And we have a lot of expectation, that where I parked it is where it's going to be sitting when this is over.
And that it's going to start.
And that it's going to start, or that the key is going to be there.
The key to put the ignition.
Yeah, So there's all kinds of constancy that we are imputing on basically inconstant things. The key is always in this wallet on this side. I put it there this morning. Well, where did it go? So then, if we didn't have some kind of understanding of that, and we see someone getting flustered or worse, maybe frustrated, or maybe yesterday Maha started to throw a tantrum, which she did not. But if she did throw a tantrum, and we had no understanding that that's the suffering that is arising due to not getting, deep way, not just intellectually, and recognizing that, oh my God, I would probably be in that same situation. So it's a point of connecting and say, yeah, this is what happens when we impute constancy to something that is fundamentally, or to all things that are fundamentally inconstant. We have a lot of expectations, you know, like when we left the house. Of course, house, car is all easy, and then let's get to things that are really at stake. Right? The kid that you left at home, you expect to come back to the same kid. Well, God forbid, you know. Oh, just triggered something. No, other cat, you know, let me trigger more. Let me dig myself out of this by triggering more. Panic. You know, the house.
He's not the same kid, is he?
Yeah, you know, it's not the same kid. You know. So the more we kind of become, so on so many levels, you know, on the level of like expectations and the suffering that comes from that expectation, but also, let's say nothing happens. It's just to encounter, here is a different kid, or a different dog, or a different house. Not just for bad things happening, you know, it's not that it's always this bad thing, it's just, it changes. You know, so having some kind of, being ready to kind of the freshness of that experience. And when we forget the freshness of that experience, then dukkha kind of turns up. Yeah.
It's like Aisha said yesterday, we need to send each other regular texts that say, what did you expect?
Uh-huh. Right. What do you expect? Expectations. So on the kind of like practical level, beyond just thinking philosophically, all these subtle levels, but really kind of, you know, it is. I mean, it's maybe at this point we don't so effectively apply these three subtle levels or the other two subtle levels. So if we can just stay even at just the first level of understanding, clinging to I, with the thought. At first, there's not even like any overt clinging. Just the thought, just the sense, just the sensation of self, I, me. And how that begins to proliferate into the whole gamut of the complex universe, the complex, complicated world that we live in. So this next line, bodhisattvas, see them thus. See beings in this way, in these three ways. And so bodhisattvas, despite seeing them in these three ways, they yearn to set them free. Now the first one is kind of like, yes, set them free from the delusion of I. Second one is set them free from the delusion of unchanging. So instead, it has to be to understand rippling, fitful, fleeting. Third one is set them free from the delusion of there being essence or intrinsic nature. So instead, it's empty. Empty of intrinsic nature. And so that's with regards to what kind of beings we have compassion for. But then there's also with regards to how we need to continue, how karuna continue to be relevant even when in fact nothing happens. This is that tension I talked about yesterday, early in the day. That in the Buddhist system or tradition, this is the kind of, I find to be kind of the very pregnant or the very meaningful kind of tension. Very creative possibilities are there. Like this tension between nothing happens and therefore we do this and that. There are no sentient beings in ultimate analysis, and therefore, relatively speaking, we work for the happiness of all beings. There's no way to really work for the happiness of all beings if we think of all beings as concretely all beings, this, and then all. Then you'll be overwhelmed. But if you only think there are nothing, no beings, nothing, no coming, no going, kind of like Nagarjuna's language, no coming, no going, no increase, no decrease. If you just go there, so that means you're only on the ultimate level language. That's when we say it's nihilistic. You've kind of veered off in the direction of nothing matters. It's like, no, look. For those who have not realized that yet, it's real, and they're suffering. So sometimes an example I like to use is like, it's like a child that is convinced that each time you turn off the lights in the room, the monsters in the closet and under the bed turns up. You can't just drag the kid into the closet to show that there isn't a monster in there or under the bed. You further traumatize them. So then you have to work with them on that level of perhaps, okay, we'll keep the lights on, you'll be safe. Then maybe later, here's a magic saber, keep it with you, and so on and so forth. Because illusory phantoms can produce felt results. So then you have to use illusory methods to overcome illusory phantoms. I remember Zhongshan Khyentse Rinpoche has given a series of teachings from this Madhyamaka Avatar text. So actually, if you do search on Siddhartha's Intent, that website, you can download a whole thick commentary on the entire Madhyamaka Avatar. But if you just want to read at the beginning where he comments about these verses, and also recordings of his teachings, many years ago I listened to that set of teachings. I remember where he talked about, he said, so So he says compassion, compassion, compassion. And we talk about compassion. And then in the West, we talk about compassion, meditating on compassion. And he said, like, our notion of compassion often is very imprecise and kind of superficial. And it could be on that level of like suffering with, you know, and then suffering, suffering, suffering. And it's all just suffering. And then the more you practice, then the more miserable you become. And then when you're miserable, you cannot be good for anyone at all. But then he goes on more, I think, actually maybe he didn't say all of that, but the example that I know he gave was, he said, then if you are so, if you don't get it, you know, if you don't get on the deeper level, the second and the third type of compassion, which is infused with a more profound understanding of what is it, you know, when I look over there and I say, there is suffering there, but what is it, you know? And so on the first level, if I didn't know him, maybe I would have less compassion. And now I have a name to associate, you know, so I say, oh, this is someone I know. So then you have more compassion. But maybe there is just suffering with. But then when I see deeper, I say, the suffering that is going on is because this person is so strong, the self-grasping. So then I work with that situation on that level. Then deeper than that would be that lack of understanding of inconstancy. And then finally, the lack of understanding of essenceless. Not just that person, but even me, right? So it's not just the person suffering lacking that. When I also lack that or lose sight of that, then what is the result? So Chosang Yensei Rinpoche gave a good example. He said, and this was, I think he was teaching in Taiwan. So Taipei is a pretty, you know, in Asia it's a pretty advanced city. And in fact, compared to American cities, there are barely no homeless people. There are, you know, like beggars. But really, compared to major cities in America, very few. And so he said, you know, on your way to teachings this morning, you might have seen, you know, a couple of homeless people or beggars, you know. And then you because you are in such a good Buddhist mood, you know, you've been coming to these teachings every day for 2 weeks now or whatever, you know, you're like, oh yeah, here, you know, you can have my breakfast, you know, you can have my Starbucks that I just picked up, you know, even though you like your coffee a lot, you need it for the teachings, you know, you see this like, here, have my muffin, have my, you know, you say, yeah, sure, because it's 1 or 2. Yeah? And he says, now, if you suddenly transported to Delhi, and especially if you're a foreigner, because they go after you, yeah? And you just step out of the airport, and swarms of them come to you. Now what? I know what happens. I take people to Asia, completely overwhelmed. People are traumatized. I had students who didn't want to leave their hotel room. You know, when we went to Tibet to go on the Barco, you know, they're terrified because all these beggars would come and tug at them and please, you've been, you know, you're completely overwhelmed. And he said, now, you could protect yourself from being overwhelmed by shutting down. But that's not compassion. That you've gone back many steps. You have fallen back many steps. But then if you suffer with, then you get overwhelmed. So then how do you not suffer with, not shut down, but really generate compassion for? And he also said, again, helping someone in a simple situation, yeah, okay, you know. But then what if someone or your spouse, you know, has a very serious addiction? Then it becomes a lot harder. And part of it becoming harder is also you have a very solid idea of who this person is. And then no matter how much you help, that person is still lying to you. How are you going to handle that? How soon are you going to give up? So he said, the more solidly you hold on to this person having an essence, then the less you'll be able to just be there and no matter what, be there. And he said, you know, well, he didn't say, but you know, I'm sure we're not talking about like, you know, a martyr syndrome. No matter what, I will be there for you, you know, and to be miserable together. But the Buddhist effective compassion is not about being there together to be miserable, to torture each other till the end. Neither is it to walk away. But to be there because you understand these levels and still be there. It's hard. So for most of us, stay on the first one. If we could do the first one, we're already very good. Then some understanding and insight from the second and the third. And being realistic and knowing how far we are from being able to do the second and the third. But to know that it is possible. So that understanding, that insight is important. So it's easy to help one or two, but yes.
Oh, I was thinking about like the people in Virginia and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That the second one about impermanence is very hopeful in a way because we can see that we will not always be, or there are
Yes.
other options that
Yes.
it looks like
Yes.
there's these absolutes,
Yes,
you
it's
know,
absolutes.
at war going
Right.
on between this view and this view,
Right.
and everything's very stuck.
Yes.
But if we believe that, then we're stuck. And
Exactly.
so if we can,
And apply it in all situations,
right,
including
anywhere, right?
including
Because,
the suffering that we were talking earlier
yeah,
about the teachers
including the teachers.
who have let the students down and all of that. Again, they are not solidly this or
Right.
that way.
There's life, there's openness, there's
Yeah.
holes in
There's
the picture.
there's holes in the
Holes
picture.
in the picture.
Do we want to let light come in, you know, and then work with that, or are we going to solidify each other's concreteness?
Bad guy's always a bad guy.
Yeah, bad guys always bad guys.
I just find that it's easy to get kind of conceptual about this,
Yes.
you know, and so and it's easy to kind of find yourself placating your suffering with this kind of framework of like, yeah, okay, I understand that, you know, and it kind of dulls down the discomfort. But I've been really impressed with the metta practices where you're not really talking it from a concept down, but you're just
Yes.
saying, we know that feeling.
Yes.
And so I was thinking it's like, well, in that way, if you just talk to me about metta from a conceptual point of view, I wouldn't necessarily know what you're talking about as an experience other than what experience I have had. So real compassion. Can I say that has that same warmth
Oh,
behind the
no. So compassion here. So Jigten Sungren, just as he gave us a way to identify what is metta, he also gave us a way to identify what is karuna. So he says karuna is that feeling that you have when you see someone suffering. Suffering. More specifically, he says when you see someone with leprosy. In his time, leprosy is our equivalent of cancer, AIDS. The way it triggers that immediate response of like, don't want, how to free, how to relieve. That, he says, that's
Which is
karuna.
different from aversion.
Hmm?
Which is different from aversion.
It's different from aversion. Yeah. Well, if anything, I mean, if you want to use the word, it's aversion towards pain. It's like, no. And so it says, it's like a mother. Again, in other contexts, I don't know if Jesus would use as mother in this case. In other contexts, it says, it's like seeing your mother suffering. And you can't bear to see that. That's very instinctive for most people. And again, before narratives come in, you know, but that instinctive response when you see someone you care about suffering is you want to yank them out of that. Then now, in the technique that we use for metta, you practice karuna by again thinking of the times where people have shown you that. How people have lifted you out of suffering. See, it's the same. It's just that in the first one is how people have given you, given you, facilitated your happiness, given you happiness, given you. But here, now start recalling all the times that someone has genuinely felt like these even moments, wanting you to be free from suffering. Times when you were ill, when you were sick. So like I said, you know, like they are not two different things actually. It's both sides of the same coin. It's just where you nuance it. Here you are nuancing it from the desire to be free from suffering.
The compassion, I mean, real compassion would have to do with your own experience of your own insubstantiality or something, you know, your own empty nature in a way. Right? I mean, you would have to understand for yourself
That's actually the
the
third.
source of your suffering.
That's actually
to
the
understand
third
somebody
level.
else's.
Yeah, we don't start there.
We don't start.
Yeah,
No, but you would have to have some inkling that my suffering is caused from confusion of all sorts
You could.
to kind of understand.
You could,
you know,
but not necessarily.
what is-
Yeah, something even more instinctive. And in that sense, you don't even need to have that inkling to have compassion. The definition of compassion is when you see someone with leprosy. Well, then the next moment is like, oh yeah, this person deserves it. There's something else going on. Yeah, again, but the instinctive part.
Is it more instinctive because you can physically observe it and be like, oh, that looks really painful. That looks...
I don't know. Maybe.
It's hard to see.
I don't know if it matters.
It's like you see it and you're like, oh, ow, that looks horrible. It's like you can feel the immediacy of...
Maybe. Maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering along the same lines. I think you're talking about empathy, where you feel that person's pain. It's not,
Or you recognize it.
you recognize it.
But it's also your
Experience.
own.
Yes. 'Cause you've
It doesn't matter,
experienced
you know, whether it's other people, you, just the desire, the wish to be free from suffering. That's karuna. So in exactly the same way that we did the metta exercise, you do the karuna exercise. By first thinking of all those who have shown, who has radiated karuna to us. Then again, you are bask in the radiant light of karuna. And here is a little bit more kind of mix, because in order to feel that, you also have to open yourself a little bit up to your experience of suffering. In order to recognize that they are trying to take that away from you. And that's why it's a little bit more tricky now. Yeah, because we are allowing some of the darkness to come in. See, in the practice of metta, there is no darkness that you're allowing in. But you're allowing in enough of the darkness, right, to really get it how, these folks in this moment or that moment in the past have wanted to take away this darkness for you. Have wanted to take away this pain from you. So you have to kind of expose yourself, willing to expose yourself to memories of your own suffering. But you see, that's where it's delicate. Because you could easily then go into that space and can't come out.
You mean getting stuck in the narrative?
Or even the feeling of the pain. Yeah. Yeah. So the work of compassion is a little bit more treacherous as a training. Because it's not all just light. You have to have enough darkness to come in. Not to create, but to, we've all have enough material to work with. But now you carefully kind of open a little bit of that and let it come in. But you see, when you let it come in, you want to remember how someone have helped to take that away from you. That is the karuna that you are recognizing. Not this side. Not the bait, so to say. But the hook of compassion, we call it. So you want to then go, that is karuna. Oh. Thank goodness. It's maybe kind of akin to a Christian spiritual sense of grace. It's akin to that. Grace, of being in the presence of grace.
Coming with or without merit.
Yeah.
Without having energy.
Right.
Still
Yes.
there.
Grace. And then the next step, like metta, right? Then these beings who have radiated grace or karuna to us now come to our back, right? Putting your hands on us. And now we radiate grace to others. Then that's when you can let yourself be exposed now to all the suffering that you know is happening in the world. Then at this point, you won't be dragged down so easily. Because it's this unimpeded grace, compassion, going out. Kind of gathering all of them in. Gathering them in.
Does he talk about that in the book?
Yes.
We talked about the bad people, for who it's more difficult to feel compassion.
Yeah.
or loving kindness. So does that mean that the bad people haven't felt compassion as much?
Possibly.
And does that contribute to their badness?
Possibly. Who knows?
To their badness, you said?
Yeah. Or to their bad behavior.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think conventionally we would say that. But it's complicated, you know. Why they're behaving badly. Why we behave badly. It's kind of complicated. You know? Yeah, you could say that. I mean, that's typically what you would expect, I guess, people to say. And people within this context. Oh, you know, the perpetrators of harm is because they have not been loved enough. Possibly, I guess. Yeah, you know, yeah. But it's also kind of complex. But in this practice, it's sort of like it doesn't matter. Whatever their reasons for being bad, we are not analyzing that. In another context, when we're learning about karma, and so the next retreat or whatever, when we look at the topic of karma, then that's a different kind of muscle that we're training. Then we look into that, you know, the psychology of, you know, unskillful behavior, the effects of unskillful behavior and skillful behavior, and the psychology of skillful behavior, and all of that. Here, mostly, I think it's fair to say, we try to leave narratives and explanations of good or bad kind of alone. Because of the unconditional part. So no need to get into kind of the narratives. But in other contexts, you know, when we're studying karma, to kind of, and why are we studying karma? You know, to guide the way we act, then we would maybe look into that more. Yeah, but it's something like that. But there's, I think, quite a bit of subtleties. Let's take a break. Yeah. It's 4:15, 4:25. We will resume. Should be able to end at 5.